Good morning. How are you? I have to tell you, it is so wonderful to be back with you, and it's great to see so many people that I've met here in other times and in other situations. And I wanted you to know first and foremost that I have been holding all of you and all in your diocese in prayer, and Bishop Cirillo, I know that this has been a tough week for everyone, and I'm with you this day in prayer, as I know all of you are with the others in your diocese, and will continue to be. And now I know that we also need to be holding Arno and his family in prayer, and so we'll continue to do that as well. I'm wondering, and it's going to take me a minute to get my computer connected again, but as we get started, how many of you have done StrengthsFinder? Okay, so many of you. Those of you who have done StrengthsFinder, how many had done it prior to the preparation for today? Okay, wonderful. That just helps me to know where we are as a group. Give me just a second, and as I'm getting the computer set, why don't you do this? If you have not done StrengthsFinder, think about this. When was a time when you felt like you were facing a task and you knew exactly what was needed in the situation? And when was a time when you faced a task and you felt like you had no clue, that this was just not the thing that was for you? And actually, I think that's a good conversation for all of us to have. So think about that for just a moment. When was a time when you felt like you were facing a situation and you had exactly what was needed? And then when was a time when you faced a situation and you went, this is just not something that I feel equipped to handle? What happened in those situations? Take a few moments and just turn to one or two people near you and talk about that, and we'll let that lead us into our time together. So what is it like to face a task and feel like you just don't feel equipped? What's that like? It's bad. Panic. It's scary. What's it like to face a task and feel like I've got exactly what's needed for this situation? Joyful, you're in the right place. Now, isn't it amazing that given that, we know it in our hearts, we know it through our experience, and yet, all over the world, when asked, which would you rather have? A list of your greatest talents so that you can build on them, or a list of your greatest weaknesses so you can fix them? What do you think people answer? Weakness. It's amazing. And it's actually very interesting. I've seen recently that there's new brain research that says that we are in some ways hardwired to hold on to what's wrong. It comes from our primitive time of fight or flight. We needed to know where the threat was. And so we held on to that because we needed to remember what those potentially harmful things were. And yet, the research that is underpinning StrengthsFinder very clearly shows, no surprise, we're at our best when we do what we do best. That weakness fixing, at best, produces adequacy. And that's really what we're going to be thinking about in the time that we have this morning. The StrengthsFinder that many of you have already participated in was developed by Dr. Donald Clifton and a team of faculty members at the University of Nebraska in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And then that work continued into the latter part of the previous century. Dr. Clifton and his team represented people from the College of Counseling and the College of Nursing and the College of Education at the University of Nebraska. And as people who were involved in the education of undergrads, they had developed a peer mentoring program. So older college students were mentoring younger students, kind of a peer ministry sort of thing. And they began to notice after a few years of this process that there were some young people who did the training as mentors, followed the steps, had the conversations that they were instructed to have, and everything was fine. But there were other students who took that same training and they just seemed to know what to do. They didn't always follow the steps exactly as they had been taught, and yet they seemed to have innate talent as mentors. And the mentoring relationship showed that. And so they began to wonder, is it possible that there are certain talents that lead to good mentors? And if we could figure out what those talents are, and then we could help people to identify their talents, we would have the best mentoring program that we could ever imagine. Well, of course, it didn't take long before they went, wait a minute, if we can do that, we could identify the talents that lead to good nurses and good teachers and good counselors. And can you imagine the impact that that would have in people's lives? So they went to their professional organizations and they asked for lists of the best of the best. Who has been identified as the best teacher or the best nurse? And they went and they started talking with these people and they started doing surveys with them and focus groups. And what they found was that there was no magic counseling list or nursing list or teacher list. That instead, the people who were really thriving, not only in their workplace, but in all of their lives, were people who just had a sense of what their talents were. And they were using those talents in all of the areas of their lives. So Dr. Clifton and his team began simply to identify all of the talents that people possess in one degree or another. They ended up with a list of like 400 and something talents. But, you know, they were already trying to make this something that was going to have an impact in people's lives, and they were thinking, okay, so we can't give people a list of their top 5 out of 400. That's not going to be particularly helpful. So they took all of those talents and they began to group them. And they ended up with 34 themes of talent. So those of you who have done StrengthsFinder, you got your top 5 themes of talent out of 34. I actually heard this story of the development of this resource from Sister Joanne Miller. Joanne was part of Dr. Clifton's team in the early years, and she actually moved with him when his organization, which eventually did help people to be identified into, to be selected into certain career paths, they developed interview-based resources that they called perceivers. And those interview-based perceivers took into account the talent research along with a whole bunch of other factors. It wasn't just talent. It was skill, it was knowledge, it was experience, and so on. And so they developed an organization that they called SRI, Selection Research Incorporated. And in the 1980s, SRI acquired the Gallup organization, but they kept the Gallup name, because Gallup was already, by that time, recognizable. And in fact, Dr. Clifton's grandson is the CEO of Gallup, and his granddaughter is one of their principal department heads. And Joanne Miller, who was part of Dr. Clifton's original team at the University of Nebraska, just retired from Gallup this summer. So it still is an ongoing project. They're continuing to develop new resources. They're continuing to find ways to make this more readily available to people. And they're also helping us to recognize the impact of knowing our talents, not only for our parishes, not only in our work environment, but in all of the areas of our lives. What some of the research suggests, I think, is incredibly important for us as parish leaders. First of all, the way that they identify a talent, the way they define talent, is actually something that's very different from what our normal thought about talent would be. We think of talent and we think of the talent to play a musical instrument or to be an athlete or to do math really well or whatever. But the way they define a talent is a naturally recurring pattern of thinking, feeling, or behaving that can be productively applied. That's a different way of thinking about this, isn't it? It's much more innate. And actually, one of the things that the research says is that, people will say, well, why do I need to do StrengthsFinder? Why do I need to do an assessment to figure out my talents? I already know myself. And in fact, some people really do. But what the research says is our greatest areas of talent are often so innate to us that we don't recognize them without some help. And interestingly, we almost always think, well, isn't everybody good at that? And aren't the things that I hate to do the things that everybody hates to do? As a parish volunteer and then later as a parish staff person, I always hated asking people to do the things that I hated to do because I assumed that they hated those things too. Well, it turns out there are some of those things that other people really like to do. And that was an eye-opener for me, because then all of a sudden I didn't have to worry about asking somebody, could you create a spreadsheet for this and maybe keep, oh yeah, that's my husband, that's easy. And I'm glad you think it's easy, because that's not easy to me. And so one of the key things that we learn in identifying talent and helping people develop their talents is each of us has a unique combination of talents, and particularly strength of those talents. And when we begin to factor in our knowledge and our skills and our things we're passionate about, each of us has something truly unique to contribute. And if we don't offer that in our world, something is going to be missing. And so when we begin to think about that in light of the call to be good stewards of our talents, we begin to immediately see the connection. Because as we invite people to discover and then to develop and then to offer their talents as good stewards, they begin to realize that if they do not do that in the ways in which they can, something's missing. And they're not responding to the gift and the blessing that God has given them in the ways in which they might. So it's really important. And I cannot tell you how many parishioners I've met over the years who, and I'm among them, who have said, this truly has changed my life. It's changed my relationship with my husband. It's changed my relationship with my children. It changes the way in which I interact with people, even if they've not done StrengthsFinder. Cindy knows, I'll say, I bet there's a little bit of activator happening in that person, Where in the past I might have said, gosh, he's so impatient. It's a different way of looking at it, isn't it? Yeah. And so that's what happens in all of the areas of our lives. The other thing that I'll share with you really quickly is and I know some of you already have worked with this in your parish situations. I'm sure you've experienced this too. People almost immediately say, I'm more patient, I'm more forgiving. I'm looking for the best of the person instead of sort of looking for the worst. And I'm recognizing the best in myself instead of always focusing on what needs to be fixed. So StrengthsFinder has started to be used in parishes all over the United States and Canada and in other places. We're in touch with people in South Africa. We've had communication with a guy in Holland. Everything has to be translated. We've got folks in Australia who are exploring this, and the reason for that, I believe, is that once people discover their God-given talents, something changes in their lives, and not just their life in the parish. And in fact, when we bring this process to our parishes, it really helps them to come alive, because all of a sudden, it's not only about stewardship at the parish, it's about stewarding our talents in all of the areas of our lives. What the research says is that the themes are not equally distributed. Some of the themes of talent happen more readily in people than others. How many of you who have done StrengthsFinder have Achiever in your top 5? Oh my gosh, really? Wow. Okay, well, Achiever is the most frequently found. Let me give you a sense of what Achiever is like for those of you who have not done StrengthsFinder. How many of you make lists? What do you do when you do something that's on your list? Cross it off. What do you do something that wasn't on your list? What do you do? Add it so that you can cross it off. How many of you make lists on vacation? Oh, yeah. Okay, that's a little glimpse into what achiever talent is like. And the achiever, the essence of achiever is there's a drive to accomplish. So that crossing it off is that sense of, I did something. I get to, and that's why you add it so that you can cross it off, because you want to be able to say, I did this. And oh, there's nothing as good as looking at the end of the day at that list and going check, 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 check. Yeah, that's the achiever talent. And it's actually the most readily found, okay? So, but the themes are not equally distributed. Within each theme, there are roughly the same number of men and women. So even though culturally we might have an impression that certain themes are more masculine or more feminine, that is actually not true. The themes are equally distributed among men and women. The themes are also not culturally biased. A learner looks like a learner all over the world. So that's important to know. StrengthsFinder itself is actually available in 19 languages. The Living Your Strengths book that a lot of the parishes use is available in English and Spanish. But people can go on and they can do StrengthsFinder in their native language and actually get their report in their native language. And I think that's helpful for us to know. Even though the themes are not equally distributed, if they were, just based in simple probability, we would have a 1 in 278,000 chance of meeting someone in our lifetime with the same top 5 themes of talent. It gets better. You'd have a 1 in 33 million chance of getting the same top 5 in the same order. And by the way, for those of you who have or have not done StrengthsFinder, the order does matter. It's a numerical order, and you can actually get your full 34 themes, so you can see them all in order. You have a 0.77 chance of getting the same top 5 again if you do StrengthsFinder again, which statistically is extremely valid. What it means practically is usually people will end up with 3 or 4 themes that stay the same and 1 or 2 that switch. And those 1 or 2 are typically things that were in your next 5 had you known them. And so sometimes people will say, I just want my next 5. I just want to know what my full 10 are. Great, go do StrengthsFinder again. You're probably going to get a couple of more. It's true. I've done it 4 times. I have 8 themes that just keep moving around a little bit, but they're the same 8. And actually, the people who have been part of the longevity studies of this say their top 10 has stayed amazingly consistent. The research says our talents develop most primarily between age 3 and age 14 or so. And they really say it is a thing about nature and nurture, that there are certain things that come naturally to us, that, you know, the steps just happen, that we gravitate toward those things. And so in our developmental years, what's happening is they say it's like a path that gets used a lot becomes a highway, and a path that doesn't get used so much gets overgrown. It isn't that that overgrown path isn't still there, it's just harder to access. And one of the interesting things about this is that I was a high school counselor for 11 years, and I wasn't always really good at it. It didn't come easily to me. Now I know why. Restorative, which is the theme of talent that kind of says, I'm going to put you in the middle of a crisis and you're going to find the way out, that's my number 33 theme out of 34. And that would be very helpful as a counselor. I was really good at the academic part of counseling, by the way. I just wasn't good at the crisis intervention stuff, even though I was the designated go-to crisis person when it happened. But the interesting thing is, when I need to be empathetic, I can do it. It just doesn't come naturally to me the way my greater areas of talent do. And that's important for us to think about, because sometimes, especially as people are first beginning this process, they'll say, well, I just don't have any talent in that. Well, that's not like a get out of jail-free card, you know? You don't get the pass that says, I don't have to be empathetic. No. But here's the thing. Maybe it doesn't come so naturally to some of us. What's the talent that we do have that we can employ in order to be able to do those things that don't naturally come easily? So as you were thinking about that, you know, when was a time when I didn't feel equipped? What talent do you have that you could apply in a situation like that? That's a different way of looking at it. Or who could I partner with? That's another way of looking at it. Who does have the talent that I don't have in as great a degree? And that's part of the strengths process. It's this identifying, what am I really good at? Where do I play best? Not that we get to do that all the time, but hopefully we at least get to do it some of the time. I'm in a very blessed situation now that I get to do it most of the time. You know, most people don't have that, but thank God that each of us can find the ways that we can to use our talents, not only in our work environment, not only in our parish, but in our home, in the ways in which we serve in our greater community, and so on. So each of us has a unique combination of talents. And I've already mentioned some of these clues, some of these ways in which, especially for those of you who have not yet done StrengthsFinder, just think about this for a second. To what kinds of activities are you naturally drawn? That's a clue to a talent. What kinds of things, just the steps just come automatically, or you pick up very quickly? When I first started writing, and it was actually other people who said, have you ever thought about writing? And at first I went, well, yeah, I kind of did when I was in high school. It wasn't until I actually sat down and started working on what became my first book that I found that that for me is the absolutely most prayerful experience of my life. And it does come naturally to me. Well, it turns out I have ideation. I have input, so I'm always bringing in new ideas. I have futuristic, so I'm always thinking about the future. I have connectedness, so I'm always pulling all the pieces together. And then I have arranger, so I can put all of those pieces in some kind of an order. Those talents really naturally lend themselves to being a writer. But I didn't know that for a really long time. I had experienced it. Once I saw the themes, then I went, oh my gosh, how could I not do this? And that's part of the process as well. In what activities have you lost track of time? When I'm writing a book, my husband will come home and he'll go, are you still at that desk? Yeah, I am. I'm totally lost in time, you know, and have to literally pull myself away from the computer to get back to other things. And then during what activities have you said, when do I get to do that again? Those are all clues to talent. So if you've not done StrengthsFinder, you can actually start thinking about this just in those ways. If you have done StrengthsFinder, you have themes of talent, but even within each of those themes, as that example just kind of illustrated, those themes are groupings of lots of talent. And so we experience those talents, themes, in different ways, depending on the other aspects of our lives that inform this. I wanted to say one more thing, and now I lost my train of thought, so I'll come back to it. There was one more element of that I didn't want to forget, but I'll come back. Talent is a multiplier, and I think this is really helpful for us. We all have certain skills, and we have knowledge, and we have experience. And then the talent really brings that to life. It multiplies it, and particularly when we consciously and intentionally develop it. You know, so knowing that I have ideation talent, well, that's really nice, but unless I'm going to develop it and use it in some productive way, and actually that's part of the definition that the researchers use. It's a naturally recurring pattern of thinking, feeling, or behaving that can be productively applied. And it's that productive application that makes it a strength. Out of all of the things that I appreciate in StrengthsFinder, the one thing that I wish that they had done, I wish they had named it something else. Because it's not a StrengthsFinder. It's a talent identifier, and that's different. It's not a strength until we're productively applying it. And so that's part of the process of introducing this in our parishes. Being a good steward of our talents means we're going to use it productively. I mentioned that the outside developmental age of the development of talent is around age 14. And because of that, a lot of parishes use strengths with their confirmation candidates. I know the folks at All Hallows do that. And it's a wonderful opportunity for our young people to begin to look at what are the talents that God has given you that are going to equip you for all of the circumstances of your life as a disciple of Jesus Christ. And it's an amazing situation. And can you imagine the gift? Actually, I'll tell you a really fast story about this. Our daughter was going into her junior year of high school when we first began Strengths. And so I actually emailed Al Winsman, who's one of the co-authors of Living Your Strengths, and I said, what's the outside age? How young can they do it? And he said, easily by freshman year of high school, people can do this. So I got a strengths book for our daughter. And there's a version of strengths, the Strengths Finder itself is the same, but the report is different, called Strengths Quest, that is geared to high school and early college age young people. So I got Carrie a copy of Strengths Quest, and she did her Strengths Finder, and we talked about it. And actually, she was doing driver's ed. And so we were spending a lot of time in the car, doing those practice drives. And so we had these conversations about her talent themes. And about 2 weeks later, she came to me one day and she said, I've been thinking about that talent thing. And I said, uh-huh. And she said, I got to thinking, I was like the only kid in my class last year who actually liked chemistry. And I'm thinking about her talent themes, and I'm thinking, where is she going with this? And she said, and I got to thinking that maybe I should do something with that. And I said, great, what are you thinking? And she said, well, I love to cook. And oh my gosh, does she? I mean, the whole time she was in college, she would come home for a weekend, and the first thing we did was go to the grocery store so that she could cook whatever, because in the dorm they don't have kitchens. And so she said, so I Googled food, chemistry. And do you know there's a thing called food science? Oh. And then she says, like Alton Brown on TV. I went, okay. And I said, so what would you do with this? And she said, well, a few weeks ago, Dad and I served at the soup kitchen. And I happened to be looking at the labels of the food that we were preparing. And it was filled with sodium. It had all kinds of fillers in it. It really wasn't healthy. And she said, I just don't think it's fair that people who don't have a lot of money can't eat healthy food. She has in her top 5 developer. She has belief, which is there's a driving principle that can't be overridden. And so I can now say my daughter is a food scientist as a result of Strengths Finder. And as you can see, it wasn't just, I have this talent, therefore I should. That's not the way this works. And that's the other caution about this. Almost everybody that starts using strengths in the parish thinks to themselves, I'm going to take our ministry directory and I'm going to do all this stuff so that we can say, here are the talent themes that work with each of these ministries. That's not what the research shows. The research actually shows that almost every talent can be applied in almost every ministry. Not across the board, but almost. And so what we need to do is we need to really develop a process by which people can discern a good ministry fit in light of all of their interests and passions and their talents, so that they really have that opportunity to be their best selves in their parish. So what I'd like to invite you to do now is just to think about this for a few minutes. If you have done Strengths Finder, what experience illustrates one of your themes in action? If you have not done Strengths Finder, what experience illustrates something that you just naturally do well? And then how might you build on that for the future? When we come back, I'll walk you through the developmental path so you know what this looks like. But I'd like to have you give you an opportunity to talk first. So what's that, if you've done StrengthsFinder, you've got your themes. Kind of what's your go-to theme, or what experience illustrates one of those themes? If you haven't, just think about what you naturally do well. And then, what experience illustrates that for you? Think about that, talk about it together, and then we'll come back in about 5 minutes. So I want to share with you just very briefly the developmental path. What happens? How does this work? And then I want to share with you a little bit about how this can help us to build healthy relationships in our lives. And then I want to take a few moments to see what kind of questions you might have. The developmental path has not been clearly spelled out in any of the Gallup books to date. They continue to do a lot of research around this, but I think it's a reality that they have so many different ways in which their research is being used that they continue to develop newer ways of articulating this. So a few years ago, I emailed Kurt Liesfeld, who was also a co-author of Living Your Strengths, and I said, this is the pattern that I am seeing. What do you think? And Kurt spends his life training and coaching. Some weeks, his days are filled with hour-long coaching slots with people all over the world that he's on the phone with doing strengths coaching one-on-one. And so between he and I, we ended up putting together this little path that describes what happens, how we develop our talents. The first thing is discovery, and some people just naturally know what their talents are. Most people do not. Most people, when they look at their top 5, they go, yeah, that has been a part of me, or gonna need to think about this. And in that moment of discovery, most people have at least one of their talents that they really have to learn to accept as a talent, because either they or someone that they're close to has convinced them that it's a weakness. It's a very strong experience, but very often it's a strong experience of a perceived weakness. Some people who have empathy in their top 5 will say, I've been told all of my life, you've got to toughen up. Stop wearing your heart on your sleeve. You're going to make yourself sick. Some people, especially my age or older, who have competition, will say they've been told all of their lives, stop being so competitive. Now it's interesting, when I talk with younger adults about that is not their experience. And in fact, many of them will say, no, I've actually been told, be more competitive. Some people with self-assurance are told, you don't have to be quite so sure of yourself all the time, and so on. My former pastor had a seminarian intern living with him last year, and he called me and said, I need you to meet with my seminarian intern. And I said, okay, what's going on? And he said, well, I gave him StrengthsFinder, and he's really having a hard time with this. So I made an appointment. We sat down in the parish conference room, and I said, what's going on? And he said, those 5 things are the exact 5 things that I have been told all of my life are my weaknesses. Yeah. And he said, and that's continued in the seminary. And so I need to understand this. Yes?
Just from what you said, it seemed to me that it's because it's not productive, the end of that talent.
That's very possible.
So therefore, based on what you said,
yes,
talent is something that has to be fruitful.
Yes.
Effective.
Yeah.
So it could be being a competitor. If it's not productive,
yes,
it's not a talent.
Right.
It's more like a vice.
Well, it's a talent, but it's not being used as a strength yet. And that's, thank you for that insight, because that's really important. What we ended up doing, and this comes back to this path, because what Kurt said is, it's not only that you need to discover your talents, you need to accept them as talents. He says you can't live your strengths until you love your strengths. And so what I did with the seminarian was I said, okay, we're going to look at those top 5, and you're going to find one of those themes that you can point to an experience that you would call good or successful. And we get all hung up in our church environment about success. You know, well, God wants us to be successful. God has given us gifts to be successful. We don't have to be cocky about it, but God gives us these talents to be used well. It took him about 20 minutes. And he finally said, well, and his number one theme is an election. And he said, you know, I do think about things a lot. And sometimes I'm actually able to help people with their coursework because I've thought about it so much that I can explain it to somebody else. I went, that's a gift. And all of a sudden he went, oh, and then, and it started boom, 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 boom. And within 40 minutes, the whole thing had changed for him. He now has become such an advocate of this that he bought strengths codes for all of his seminary classmates. And when they came back from their year of internship, he gave them all codes and said, you have to do this. And he's trying to talk the seminary into building it into their seminary formation. We'll see if that happens. But so we have to discover, and then we need to accept those talents as talents. That's the first step. The second step, you just started. If this is your first experience with strengths, or if you've not done strengths yet at all, the next step is then, how have I experienced this in a good way? How have I experienced this with success? And then how can I build on that for the future? By myself or with others. The next step then is we begin to partner with others by way of our talents. And I'll show you in a minute how that might work. And then finally, we just get into a groove where every now and again we go, wow, that's what this is like. And then we're really good stewards of those talents. So there is a developmental path, and that's helpful, I think, for us to know. Offering our talents and being aware of our talents in our relationships with others really, truly can change the way in which we interact, whether we know their talents as identified in StrengthsFinder or not. Just that awareness that not everybody's like me. And some people have talents that are vastly different than mine.